What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I got a brand new video for y'all, and today we're going to be doing a tier list of Canada's prime ministers. So we have this new tier list because it is 2025, or I should say 2026 actually, and we do have a new prime minister since then. And so we do have Mark Carney, who's now going to be added to the list. So definitely going to be interesting to see if the rankings have changed since then. But this is the first time doing this on this channel. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I'm going to do it in chronological order, and I'm going to explain a bit about each prime minister as to why I put him at a specific tier or not. And I know there's going to be some questions as to, some other aspects of these prime ministers' terms that I should maybe consider, but I'm just going to say this right now at the start of the video. I am basing this purely on a few things, which is their overall contribution to Canada, their treatment of Indigenous peoples, or the relationship with them, I should say, as well as their overall impact for Canada today. So that's going to be something that's more applicable to the guys that have been, in the older, some of these older prime ministers. I think it's going to be more applicable to them than, Mark Carney, for example. But let's get into it right away. So we're going to start off with Sir John A. Macdonald. He was the founder of Canada. And, there's a book by J.D.M. Stewart that I read, and it sort of spoke about the prime ministers. And one of the prime ministers focused on was John A. Macdonald. Now, before that, I would have probably put Macdonald at a B tier or maybe an A tier. But after that book, I am going to put him at an S tier. Now, Macdonald was not a perfect prime minister by any means. He wasn't a perfect person. But the overall contributions of John A. Macdonald to Canada have been pretty ridiculous compared to some of these other prime ministers. Ridiculous in a good way. And by that I mean, he pretty much built up Canada from basically nothing. We were a British colony. Frankly, we didn't have much guidance or any national leader before John A. Macdonald. He's basically our George Washington, is the best way of putting it. And I don't think any American citizen would really put George Washington below an S tier. So for those reasons, I am going to put John A. Macdonald at an S tier. Additionally, I do want to consider I would say, the misinterpretation of John A. Macdonald's relationship with Indigenous peoples. It is pretty interesting to note that he was not the racist, anti-Indigenous person that everybody thought he was. Yes, there were some policies that his party did promote and or pass that were inherently anti-Indigenous to some extent, but he was actually pretty open to Indigenous people. He would invite them to his house all the time. He actually named one of his daughters after some sort of Cree name, or after Cree general, something like that. I read in the book. So he definitely wasn't as bad as people thought he was. And who was actually as bad as we thought he was is the upcoming guy. But before we get to that, I do want to say really quickly, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. We are brand new here, Altai Politics, and I'm going to be uploading pretty often, so make sure to ring that notification bell as well. And let's go to the next one. So Alexander Mackenzie is definitely one of those guys that, I think I would have probably put him at a B tier. I think I'm going to put him at a C tier now. Really didn't do too much during his time as prime minister. He was only there for 5 years. He was the first liberal prime minister. I do have to note that John A. Macdonald was a conservative. And the only reason why he really came into power was because of the Pacific scandal, which is one of those reasons why some people would put John A. Macdonald in A tier. Overall, though, John A. Macdonald was removed, or I should say pretty much was forced to resign because of that. And that opened up the way for Alexander Mackenzie to come in as prime minister. It's not because Alexander Mackenzie was that much, that superior to John A. Macdonald that he ended up becoming prime minister. It was just because John A. Macdonald was forced to resign in that situation. Overall, yeah, he did pass the Indian Act as well. That's important to note, which was the anti-Indigenous legislation in the the late 19th century that really did sort of spearhead the residential school, institutions that would later on flourish in Canada under many prime ministers up until about Pierre Elliott Trudeau, which we're going to get to that in a second. Not in a second. It's going to take a bit to get to him. But anyways, let's move on. John Abbott, D tier. And by the way, for these next few prime ministers, they're probably mostly going to be in D tier just because, they weren't there for a long time and there's not really much to judge them on. But John Abbott didn't really do much, and yeah, he's kind of a D tier. He came after John A. Macdonald passed away, so really not much to evaluate him on. John David Thompson Sparrow, whatever his name is, D tier. Again, very short lived, like 2 years or something. Didn't really do much during his time. Mackenzie Bell, also D tier. Didn't do much either. Again, they call these the lost four prime ministers. That's what historians refer to them as. refer to them as, because they really don't know what they did during their time. They didn't really have any tangible results during their time as prime minister, so there's not much to judge them on. And then we have Charles Tupper, who was there for like 60 days. I mean, I would put him at an F tier because he was just very ineffective. But he was, I think, the oldest prime minister, if I'm not mistaken. I think he was like 70 years old or something when he was sworn in, 70 something. So he was definitely on the older side, but he didn't really have any contributions at all. So D tier. Wilfrid Laurier. So he was the Liberal prime minister. He served for about 15 years. So I think he was I think he was the third longest serving prime minister. Wilfrid Laurier, I do have to say, my perspective on him has changed quite a bit. I will put him in A tier. And the reason why I put Wilfrid Laurier at A tier is because, first of all, he was the first Quebec prime minister in Canadian history. He was also the, probably I would say, one of the most recognizable Liberal prime ministers in history. So he was quite influential in that respect. And, he was the guy who sort of coined the term sunny ways. So if you guys remember when Justin Trudeau won in 2015, he said, sunny ways, my friend. That was basically just a copy of Wilfrid Laurier because he's the guy who sort of made that idea. He brought in Alberta and Saskatchewan. He did have the Manitoba schools question, which essentially, to boil it down, simply was, it had something to do with Catholicism and whether or not Catholics should be allowed to teach or something like that in Manitoba or east of that area. So didn't really deal with it too effectively. It had to do with like the French language too. It was something weird. I mean, we can actually look it up right now. They don't really teach this in school, by the way. So if we just take a look at it, publicly funded, yeah. So it was separate schools for Roman Catholics and Protestants. This was a French English / Catholic Protestant issue. He had that issue to deal with. I mean, obviously didn't get completely dealt with. He created the Navy, so that's another big thing. And he did also do, what else did he do? Oh yeah, there was the Boer War, which if you guys remember, Britain had in South Africa, and he sort of, I'd say he dealt with it pretty well, and we'll see some other conflicts with Canadian prime ministers and how they dealt with it in the future. But I'd say Wilfrid Laurier overall was a pretty good prime minister. In terms of Indigenous relations, he was kind of, I would say indifferent, but I would say he wasn't as good in Indigenous relations as Johnny MacDonald was. So it is pretty interesting to note that, when protesters take down statues of MacDonald, they don't take down statues of, Wilfrid Laurier, which is pretty interesting. But nonetheless, I think I'll put him in A tier. He was a pretty solid prime minister and definitely one of those guys that's like a liberal icon within Canadian politics. Sir Robert Borden. Okay. Robert Borden, I've been very tough on him before, and to be quite honest with you, I think I'm going to be tough on him again. I'm putting him in a C tier. Now, Robert Borden was the Conservative Prime Minister during World War I, so he was in a pretty pivotal moment in Canadian history. He was around during a pivotal moment. But I didn't like what he did for multiple reasons. There's many things I don't like about him, but I'll get into a few of them. First of all, conscription. That was a tough situation that he had to deal with. But ultimately, he was initially saying or indicating that he wouldn't impose mandatory conscription. In 1917, he imposes mandatory conscription. He introduced the income tax. That's one of those things which was bound to happen eventually, but, for it to have been introduced so early on in our history, not really too much of a fan of it. I think in the U.S. it was introduced in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken. Another thing that many people don't talk about is the fact that he actually had the opportunity to acquire Turks and Caicos for free. Like, that was given to him. Turks and Caicos wanted to join Canada. Britain wanted to give it to Canada, and he rejected it. You may be wondering, why did he reject it? It's because Canada at the time was racist, and they didn't want to have people that were not, that were black or whatever, or brown. They also had the opportunity to take Jamaica, and they didn't take it, right? Could you imagine if Jamaica and Turks and Caicos was part of Canada today? That would be pretty incredible. So that's one of those things that many people don't talk about that I do kind of think that needs to be spoken about. Another thing, I guess a good thing I could say about him is that he was a signatory of the Treaty of Versailles, but at the same token, the more we learn about history now, the more we realize that the Treaty of Versailles kind of did indirectly, or I should say not even indirectly, pretty much directly led to the Second World War and the rise of the Nazis. So definitely one of those things where obviously he couldn't have known at the time, but at the same token, I will give him credit for trying to improve Canada's image in the world stage. So Canada was involved in these big decisions that previously nobody really wanted Canada to be involved in. So I will give him some credit there, but at the same token, I just can't say that he was that monumental for Canada that he deserves to be at an A tier or an S tier. Lastly, his Indigenous relations. I mean, there's not too much information about it, but there is, the residential school system was flourishing during his time, which is a bad thing, obviously. And he didn't do anything to stop it, which, again, we'll realize, up until Pierre Trudeau, you'll realize that not many of these guys had any desire to stop it or slow it down at any point until it was kind of necessary to do so. Next up, we got Arthur Meehan. So he was an interesting one. He had two different terms within the span of about 10 years. And so, actually, not even, it was like 10 years or so, I would say. And so I think there's some things to be said about him, in terms of what he did as prime minister. He didn't really do too much. However, he did have some conflicts with our friend William Lyon Mackenzie King, which we'll get to in a second, which ended up helping him become the prime minister in 1926. So definitely was interesting in that respect. To be honest with you, he didn't really do too much, so I can't really put him at an S tier or anything. I think a fair assessment would be like C tier. He didn't really do too much, but he was successful in terms of getting back to power. But then again, that was also because of Mackenzie King's stupidity in 1926, or I wouldn't say stupidity, but lack of political instinct in 1926 with the King-Byng affair, which we'll get to in a second. So, or 1925, I think it was. Anyways, William Lyon Mackenzie King. So this guy is the longest-serving prime minister in Canadian history. He served for a total of about 23 years in non-consecutive terms. He led us through World War II. He led us through the Great Depression. He's basically, I would say he's like the FDR of Canada, except he's not the FDR of Canada, if that makes sense. He's the FDR in Canada in the sense that he was the longest serving, he was there during World War II, whatever. But he just was not FDR as a person, as a leader, as a thinker, whatever. He was not an FDR. So if we go through some of his achievements / whatever you want to call it, accomplishments, I will say his first term was kind of mid. He did have the King-Byng affair, obviously, which we'll get to in a second. He did lower some tariffs for Canada, so that was pretty interesting. And they did have the Chinnak crisis, which was a conflict between Turkey and Britain, which he dealt with pretty decently, I would say. And then for his second term, so the King-Byng affair, for those that are wondering, he wanted some sort of election. The Governor General at the time, Lord Byng, basically denied it and then dissolved Parliament and appointed Arthur Meehan to be Prime Minister. Meehan survived for not even a year. And by the end of 1926, William Lyon Mackenzie King was back as the Prime Minister. So his second term, he had 3 terms, by the way, for those that are wondering, 3 non-consecutive terms. For his second term, he had the Balfour Declaration. So those that are wondering, what is the Balfour Declaration? It was basically an opportunity for Canada to, I'd say, become a bit more independent. Oh, by the way, I forgot to rank him. I'm putting him at a B tier. I don't think he was that great. I don't think he was as incredible as people thought he was. I do have to acknowledge his electoral, accomplishments, I guess you could say, because he did win quite a few elections. I don't know what the exact number is, probably 5. But at the same token, just policy-wise, he wasn't outstanding as, MacDonald was or as Wilfrid Laurier was, and we'll get to that in a second. But yeah, so he had the Balfour Declaration, which is basically Canada becoming a bit more independent, which I do respect a lot. That was a very good move. He dealt with the Great Depression in a pretty, I guess, interesting way. And he was lucky because 1930, he basically lost in 1930. And so R.B. Bennett comes in from 30 to 35, and I'll get to him in a second. And R.B. Bennett, basically, he's the guy that everybody blames, right? Because he's there during the crux of the Great Depression. So Mackenzie King, had he been Prime Minister from 30 to 35, I don't think he would have lasted that long through World War II. But that's, we gotta give him credit there for, I guess, being lucky to some extent. And also just, having the opportunity to bounce back after being there while the Great Depression broke in 1929. So he came into power again, third term, in 35 all the way to 48. So that was all of World War II pretty much. And so he did some things. He created the CBC. He had the conscription crisis in 44, and kind of a similar situation as Borden, but slightly different because of the Second World War. And I do want to note that he was kind of a bad guy in terms of interning Japanese Canadians in camps for absolutely no reason. Now, we know that the Americans did that, and, that was something that it was a bit more common, I'd say, back in the day to just single out groups of people. But at the same token, Canada had no reason to do this. The Japanese had never attacked us, and I understand that we were allies with the United States, but he had no reason to do this. So that's another thing that's going to taint his reputation forever, pretty much. And then in terms of Indigenous relations, again, the residential schools were thriving during his time. They were probably at their peak, really, during his time and the early 20th century. And so I can't really give him any credit on that front either. So I can't put him at an S tier or an A tier because of that. And for other reasons, obviously, as well. Next up, we got Louis Saint Laurent. So Louis Saint Laurent is a very interesting guy. He was one of those guys that I think is kind of underrated, right? And I skipped over R.B. Bennett. Anyways, I'll go to Louis Saint Laurent. I think he's at an A tier, right? French Canadian. He created the Trans-Canada Highway System, or I should say, helped build it to what it is today, essentially. And that was one of those things. It's a nation-building project. That's what Eisenhower did in America with the interstate highways. And it's one of those things that we look at. It's not so flashy and fun and interesting, but it is what built our country at the end of the day, right? Johnny MacDonald built the railroads. He built the highways. So I got to give him credit there. He was appointed as prime minister first, and then he ended up winning 2 elections. So he's pretty successful in that respect. Was prime minister for about 9 years. And I do have to give him some credit. He also entered Canada to NATO, which is another big thing. So I got to give him credit there as well. And then I guess Canada had some sort of involvement with the Suez Canal crisis, but it wasn't. It was dealt with properly, I should say, at the time. Newfoundland also joined Canada during that time. So for the Newfies that are out there, give him credit. He was the guy that brought you guys in. R.B. Bennett, I'm sorry, man. He was a good lawyer, but I have to put him in a D tier. He just was not one of those guys that was able to deal with the Great Depression properly. Around the world, we saw many leaders that weren't able to deal with it. He just happened to be one of them. So, and I kind of do feel bad for him because he was dealt a bad hand. He came in 1930 when it was pretty much a year right after the stock market had crashed, and he kind of had to deal with it right away because Mackenzie King had sort of stepped away. So I do feel bad for him in that respect, but he just was not effective at all. Next up, we got John Diefenbaker. So Dief is one of those guys that really just he's very polarizing, actually. Some people think, oh, who is this guy? You ask some people, they won't even know who John Diefenbaker is, some Canadians. But John Diefenbaker was prime minister for only 6 years. I actually thought he was around for longer for some reason. But he allowed Indigenous people to vote, so that's one big thing I will give him credit for. And that does boost him up quite a bit for Indigenous relations. We'll get to his ranking in a bit. He joined NORAD, which is big for Canada. And I think the one biggest thing about him was the cancellation of Avro Arrow. So for those that don't know what Avro Arrow was, it was an aircraft that was basically intended to be a Canadian aircraft, okay? It was basically supposed to be like our F-16, right? That at the time at least. That was supposed to be our aircraft. That was our crown jewel. But he canceled it. So I haven't looked in too much as to why he canceled. There's many theories as to why he did. There's many reasons that have been public and official, and then there's some that people conspire about. Overall, if we were to look at it, yes, in 1960, if that aircraft had been made, maybe it would have changed things significantly for the future and for making a military complex in Canada. And I do definitely believe that is one thing that we need to consider. At the same token, even if it had been completed, the Avro Arrow would not be around today, right? It's a 1960 aircraft. Maybe it would have evolved, but at the same time, I really don't think it's the end of the world. I really don't think it's the end of the world. And with the military procurement that's going on right now under Carney, I do have some hope that there could be a military complex that is built up in Canada in the near future. And basically we have our own complex like the Americans, hopefully, in the near future with Carney and some of the deals he's making. I will put him at a B tier. I don't think he was incredible. He was a conservative, by the way. So I don't think he was incredible. I don't think he was as bad as people thought he was, though, just for the Avro era. Some people say, oh, he should be at F tier for the Avro era. There's no F tier in this, but some people have said, oh, he's horrible, he's awful, he's one of the worst prime ministers ever, he made one of the stupidest decisions. I don't think that's fair to say just because of one project being canceled. And you have to note as well, he didn't have any serious scandals like some of these prime ministers did. Some of these prime ministers. So we'll get to that in a second. But next up, we got Lester B. Pearson. So Lester B. Pearson. I think every Canadian should know who this is, especially the younger generation should know who he is. I think most Canadians do know, but the younger generation is not too aware of who he is. But Lester B. Pearson was basically, I would say he's the equivalent of our... I don't think the Americans really had anybody like Lester B. Pearson, to be honest with you. But he was a diplomat. We'll put it that way. He was a diplomatic, I would say, master in some ways. He was Prime Minister only for 5 years. And Toronto Airport is named after him. So that just goes to show how impactful he was during his time. So he rejected troop deployment to Vietnam. That right away on its own is like one of those things where we look back at it now and it's like, that was 100% the right decision. At the time, some people may have been thinking, oh, but Canada, maybe they're sympathizing with the communists, whatever. I wasn't around that time, obviously, but at the same token, I thought he was good for that. He made the Canadian pension plan, made the new Canadian flag, pretty cool thing as well. That's a pretty big deal, I would say. And I think really he's well known for his diplomatic, prowess before his prime ministership. So as a prime minister, I'll put him at an A tier. He's also a great person. Like everybody that's spoken, that had interaction with him said he's a great person, or that he was a great person. There really is not too much. There's not too much information about his relation with Indigenous peoples at the time because he was only there for 5 years as well. That's something to keep in mind. But from everything that we can gather, I can't say he's an S tier because that he's basically perfect. I can't put him at a B tier though, so I'll put him at an A tier. Pierre Trudeau. So, honestly, objectively speaking, Pierre Trudeau is probably a D tier as a prime minister. He might be one of the worst prime ministers ever. However, he was the guy who brought in a bunch of skilled immigrants in the 70s. So, I'll put him at a C tier, and I'll explain some of the reasons why I can't put him any higher. And that's the only reason why he's getting bumped up, that he brought in skilled immigrants during that time. So, first of all, Pierre Trudeau was the start of the end of responsible fiscal spending in Canada, I would say. Like, really, objectively. Except maybe for here, and here. Those three I'm saying. He basically brought about this ridiculous spending nonsense where we spend money that we don't have and run deficit after deficit after deficit and increase our debt. Our debt spirals out of control and we just say, oh, we'll deal with it eventually. He was the guy who introduced that. Because prior to him, there were no deficits over and over again. Right? You may have one every once in a while, but it was surpluses for the most part. I really do have to blame him for that. Now, he did do some things. Made Canada a G7 country. He also did legalize abortion, which is another thing that many people don't know. He was a very progressive liberal. I'll put it that way. He was very progressive, nearly as progressive as, maybe not as progressive as his son, but his son definitely did derive some inspiration from his actions as prime minister. He also did deal with the 1980 Quebec referendum, which again, I think that in that sense, it was good that he was the prime minister because he was from Quebec. But at the same token, for everything else, he didn't know what the hell he was doing for the economy. And Western alienation under Trudeau, I think that's one thing I need to talk about really quickly. Many people, and I'm not from Western Canada, full disclosure, I'm not from Western Canada, so I don't have any stake in Western Canada. Obviously, I like Western Canada, but I'm just saying, I don't know what it's like on the ground. However, some people have sort of exaggerated with it. Some people have not just spoken about the actual impact of Western alienation under Trudeau. The more I read about it, the more I realize that this guy truly did alienate Western Canada. And when you look at that, on the surface, you're thinking, okay, well, maybe that can be dealt with eventually. But then you have his son come in, do the same thing. So Western Canada continues to feel alienated because of this process that this guy basically created, that Pierre Trudeau started. So I don't know where most people would put him. I think it would be fair to put him as C tier. I would put him in at a D tier if there was an F, but I think just for the sake of this ranking, I'll put him at a C tier, just to be fair. But he was not, like, he was good electorally. He was a good speaker, very interesting guy in terms of that sense. But I just can't put him higher up because he was so fiscally irresponsible. And that is one of those things that we're paying today, right? So, I don't know. I can't put him any higher. Next up, we have Joe Clark. Okay, Joe Clark was, I mean, yeah, D tier. Sorry, I don't need to say much about him. Turner, D tier, not much to judge him on. He was a good guy. Both these guys were good guys, but we don't have much to judge them on. And this is not because they're bad prime ministers, the D tier. All of these guys are in D tier, except for Aubrey Bennett, are here because there's not enough to rank him on. Maybe I should make another tier. I don't know. Maybe I'll do that next time I make a tier list. Mulroney, D tier. I think Mulroney was awful as a prime minister. As a person, he was a great guy. As a prime minister, in terms of policy, he was not a good prime minister at all, for many reasons. And we see that today with free trade with Canada and the US, clearly has backfired on us. That was Mulroney. That was his doing. That was his baby, I guess you could call it, his project. I guess there were some good things, some, redeeming qualities, I guess, with South Africa and acid rain and whatever. I just didn't like him at all, for many reasons. Obviously, there's some other things as well with the economy and stuff, like privatizing Air Canada and privatizing Petro-Canada, but I just didn't like him. And he was massively corrupt, like bags of cash to pay for his children's tuition. That is pure corruption. He was not a good prime minister, first of all, for managing the economy. Second of all, he was just purely corrupt. So I can't really put him any higher than a D tier. From what I've heard, he was a good person, but I don't think that really matters in the context of ranking prime ministers necessarily. Kim Campbell, D tier. Again, another example, just placeholder. Jacques Chrétien. Okay, Jacques Chrétien, I'm putting him in S tier. I'm putting Jacques Chrétien in S tier, and some people are going to wonder, what are you talking about? Now, I wasn't around when Jacques Chrétien was prime minister. At the same token, though, he was arguably the best prime minister that we've had in the last 100 years. And the reason why I say that is because, first of all, he ran surplus after surplus after surplus. He didn't get involved in the Iraq War. He did not bend the knee to every American demand that was asked of him. He dealt with the referendum that Quebec had. He was kind of a legend. I mean, let's be honest. He almost got assassinated at his house. And then the guy comes and he tries to, I guess, attack him or whatever outside one day. And he just chokes the guy out. I mean, he was a legend. He just didn't care what people thought. And, he's one of those guys that he came and he went. But when you look back at his time, right, like, he didn't do anything too flashy. He didn't do anything incredibly insane or, nation building or anything. But when you have a situation in Canada where, your economy is just, you're running deficit after deficit after deficit, and it doesn't seem like it's improving, and you have a guy who just cleans it up completely overnight and brings you surpluses, you can't help but wonder, wow, what would have happened if Canada had this before? And so you end up elevating this guy higher, and I do have to put him much higher right now than some people would have put him maybe 20 years ago. I think he was a legend, to be quite honest with you, and I think he's one of those guys that's underrated, man. I really do think he is underrated, and he deserves to be up there. By the way, Mulroney also introduced the GST, so for those that don't like taxes, I mean, definitely give him some, I guess not some credit, but make him lose some points there for the GST. Then we got Paul Martin. Again, another kind of a legend too, because he ran the economy very well. But I put him in an A tier. I think he was a very good prime. And this is the thing, right? These two guys were liberals, right? This is what liberalism is. Socially progressive, fiscally conservative. It's not this, foo-foo, like, ridiculousness where, you're liberal socially, which is fine, and then you're radically liberal economically. Being liberal socially is fine, right? There's no problem with that. But there is an issue when you're liberal economically to the point that you're running deficits over and over again. That's an issue, right? So I don't know. I mean, I think it's one of those things that I really do think if liberals want to continue winning elections, they have to be like these two guys. They have to be like these two guys. Unfortunately, they're not always like that. Okay, well, I don't know why he's there in front of him. Then we had Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Now, I personally don't, like, I remember Stephen Harper, but I don't think he was, like, exceptionally inspirational as a leader. No doubt about it. He was definitely a very boring guy. I'll put him in a B tier, man. I mean, people look back at the Harper years and they're like, oh, we miss Harper and whatever. And I guess, yeah, that's true to some extent, that people do miss him. You know, he had good, like, the country was running well. He did have one surplus only. And he did have to deal with the recession, too, in 2008. So I do have to give him some leeway there in that respect. But at the same token, he wasn't that great. It's not like he did anything that incredible. The reason why I put him up here is because he had surplus after surplus, right? Harper had only one. I mean, that's good, but you had like 9 deficits after that, whatever the number was, right? So I don't know if I love that. I also don't think that he was a particularly good prime minister in terms of domestic policy. You know, he was kind of a bit extreme in terms of some of the plans and proposals that he had for crackdowns within Canada of suspected terrorists and whatnot. I think that was a bit extreme during Harper's time, so I can't really... I could definitely say that he was pretty tyrannical in that respect. But he wasn't terrible. He wasn't, like, awful either, so I can't put him at a C or D tier. Justin Trudeau, I would put him at... Honestly, I'm going to make a new tier. I really have to make a new tier, guys. I'm sorry. I really do. And I hate to do that because it's one of those things, like, you know, I thought this is set in stone, but... hold on, let me see if I can do this right here. I have to make a new one. And this new row is going to be called... You guys may be wondering, what is it going to be called? Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau is the worst prime minister in the history of Canada. Probably the worst leader, one of the worst leaders in history, period. He basically ruined Canada over his 10 years. Ruined the economy. Ran some of the biggest deficits ever imaginable. He actually did literally run the biggest deficits ever seen in history. He had no plan whatsoever. Was not successful on the world stage. Nobody respected him in terms of the world stage, or not Canadians, nor did Americans or Chinese or Indians. Nobody respected him. He ended up losing pretty well. He didn't lose the election technically, but he ended up resigning pretty much in disgrace within his party. And overnight, the polling flipped the moment that he resigned, because he was quite literally the problem. He was so bad that he was about to lose the election to Pierre Poilievre. I mean, how bad do you have to be to lose the election to Pierre Poilievre? Or if there were to be an election, lose to Pierre Poilievre. And by the way, you may be wondering, why am I mentioning Pierre Poilievre? Pierre Poilievre, if he had been on this list, he would be in his own tier as well, because he's awful. Or he would have been awful. And he's never going to be the prime minister ever. Mark my words, he's never going to be the prime minister. You guys can come back to whatever video you want, clip this, whatever, save it. He's never going to be the prime minister ever in any lifetime. He will always remain a career politician, but he will never have the top office. It's simple as that. But Justin Trudeau, I can go on all day about him. He pretty much, I'll put it this way. There was an article, I believe, that spoke about the lost decade. The lost decade was literally 2015 to 2025. That was all the years that Justin Trudeau was the prime minister. He consistently made stupid decisions. He had scandals after scandals. He had conflict after conflict for no reason with different countries. Not direct conflicts, obviously, but just diplomatic errors and stupidities, right? I mean, there's really no other way of putting it. I mean, we could go over the list. He had blackface as well. That was another thing. And, you know, it goes back to my theory about liberals, particularly. I can get to another video about conservatives and how they should win. But for liberals to win, you just can't. You have to be everything that is not Justin Trudeau. is the best way of putting it, because Justin Trudeau was not ready to be prime minister. He ended up getting thrust into the role, somehow won 3 elections, which honestly, to this day, I mean, it is truly mind-blowing to me that he won 3 elections. But then again, you know, it ended up blowing up in his face eventually, because he ended up leaving kind of in disgrace. People, you got to understand, Canadians are very nice people. People hated Trudeau by the end of his term, or by the end of like by 2025, even I'd say like by 2022, after the trucker convoy, which by the way, he didn't deal with that properly either. After that, I was like, this guy needs to go, because it was just anything he touched would turn into like nothing. Like it would just be destroyed. So definitely, arguably the worst prime minister in history by far, and arguably one of the worst leaders in the 20th and 21st century ever for democratic countries, right? I'm talking about democratic countries, not dictators. And he wasn't a dictator, by the way. For those that say, "Oh, Justin Trudeau was a dictator," or whatever, okay, relax. I'm not a fan of the guy in terms of policy and whatnot, but he wasn't a dictator, okay? Mark Carney, S tier. I think Mark Carney has the potential to be one of these 3 guys. I really do think so. Now, unfortunately, he did run a deficit already, which, it has to do with building up the country, in fairness. But I do anticipate that he'll be running some surpluses in the near future, maybe in the next 3 to 4 years. And I like that. He is arguably the most accomplished person to become the prime minister in Canadian history. Super smart guy, establishing relationships everywhere, distancing himself from, North American dependency. So I do have to give him credit there. And, he really is a deal maker. I really like what I'm seeing with him. And I do truly think that he's been doing an incredible job. He has had no scandals thus far. And he is doing so good that people are leaving their party to become liberals, right? They're crossing the aisle. He's 1 seat away from majority. He didn't win. He wasn't 1 seat away from majority on election day. He became 1 seat away because people started crossing the aisle to Carney and the liberals. So got to give him credit there. He's been doing a really good job there. So really, these 2 guys are, well, I'd say these 3 guys, Chrétien, Carney, and Martin, are the epitome of what it means to be a liberal. Like, these guys are perfect. These guys are business oriented, but they are also socially progressive, which ends up winning elections every single time. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, if you guys agree with my tier list or not. I definitely do think that there'll be some disagreements on, Harper and maybe Mulroney as well, and even Carney to some extent. But I do think that we can all agree that there's no disagreement with this one of Trudeau. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments below, and I appreciate all the support, and I'll see y'all in the next one.